Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive.
Yeah.
You know how much we all love chocolate, right? What if I
Yeah.
told you that your next chocolate bar could be directly tied to deforestation?
It's true. The EU is getting serious about tackling deforestation linked to the products we consume, and that includes a lot of things you might not expect.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. The EU's new deforestation-free product regulations. We're going to cover a ton of ground, the overview of the regulations, the objectives, the key definitions, all those products. It actually covers who this applies to, responsibilities, the due diligence processes involved, the reporting and information system. And finally, we'll spend some time debunking those common myths surrounding this regulation. It's be a wild ride.
I think a lot of people will be surprised at just how far-reaching these regulations actually are. We're not just talking about timber anymore. This is everything from chocolate, as you said, to furniture, leather goods, even car tires.
It's a pretty big deal, folks. So to kick things off, let's talk about the big picture.
Yeah.
What is the EU trying to achieve with this new regulation?
Well, at its core, the regulation aims to prevent products sold in the EU from contributing to deforestation globally.
So they're trying to use their economic influence to promote sustainability on a global scale.
Exactly. And this is very much in line with other major EU sustainability goals you've probably heard of, like the European Green Deal and the biodiversity strategy. The EU is a huge consumer market, so they're really stepping up and taking responsibility for their impact on forests worldwide.
So this isn't just about protecting forests within the EU. They're aiming to tackle deforestation happening anywhere in the world as long as those products end up on their shelves.
Precisely. And they're hoping to see some pretty significant results. They're projecting a reduction of at least 32 million metric tons of carbon emissions annually just from this regulation alone.
Wow, that's huge. But how's this all going to work in practice?
Well, the regulation officially came into force on June 29th, 2023, but there's an 18-month grace period for businesses to adapt. There's even been talk of extending that deadline to give companies even more time to get their ducks in a row.
That makes sense. This is pretty complex stuff. But let's get down to the nitty-gritty. How does the EU actually define deforestation? I mean, is it just about cutting down trees?
Well, it's a bit more nuanced than that. The EU defines deforestation as the conversion of forest to agricultural use. And this applies whether it's intentional clearing for farmland or the result of something like a natural disaster.
Oh, so like if a wildfire rips through an area and then that land gets converted into farmland, that would count as deforestation.
Exactly. But if that same area were left to regenerate naturally, it wouldn't fall under this definition. They're really focusing on that permanent shift to agricultural use as the core issue.
Got it. So it's not just about tree loss, it's about how the land is used afterwards.
Yeah.
Now, how about the term forest itself? What does that actually encompass?
They're using the Food and Agriculture Organization's definition, which is a pretty broad one. It includes areas you might not immediately think of, like savannas and wetlands. It's not just about those classic dense forests that probably come to mind.
Okay, so they're casting a pretty wide net here to protect various types of ecosystems. That's interesting. Now, what about forest degradation? How do they distinguish that from full-blown deforestation?
So forest degradation refers to specific types of conversion within a forest area. For example, if you change a primary forest into a plantation forest, that would be considered degradation. It's about altering the ecological character of the forest without necessarily completely removing all the trees.
Right, so it's a distinction between simply using forest land and fundamentally changing its nature. Would something like building a road through a forest be considered degradation under these rules?
That's a great question, and it might surprise you, but the answer is no. Converting forest for urban development or building infrastructure doesn't fall under the deforestation definition in this regulation.
Huh, that's interesting. So they're really laser focused on agriculture as the driver of deforestation. Now, for the million-dollar question, which products are we actually talking about here? I know it goes way beyond just timber, right?
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about a whole range of commodities here. Palm oil, cattle soy, coffee, cocoa timber, rubber, the list goes on. And here's the thing that really broadens the scope. It also includes products that are derived from these commodities.
So not just the raw ingredients themselves, but things like chocolate furniture, leather goods, even car tires.
Precisely. That's what makes these regulations so significant. They have the potential to impact a huge range of everyday products, but there are very specific rules about what is and isn't included.
Okay, let's break that down for our listeners because I'm sure they're wondering how this all works in practice.
Sure. So for a product to be covered by this regulation, it must be on the Annex I list of the regulation. A and D contain a listed commodity. So let's say you have soap made with palm oil. That wouldn't be covered because soap itself isn't on the list, even though palm oil is.
Ah, so it's a double whammy. Both the product and the ingredient have to be on the EU's radar.
You got it. And it's important to note that this Annex I list is regularly reviewed and updated so things could shift over time. Then you've got the interesting case of recycled paper and paperboard.
Right. What's the deal with recycled materials?
Well, in general, products made entirely from recycled materials aren't covered. But the reality is that most recycled paper products still have a bit of virgin pulp mixed in for strength, so it gets a little tricky.
So even a small amount of non-recycled material could trigger the regulations requirements.
Exactly. If there's any virgin material in there, even a small percentage, it needs to be traceable back to its origin. And then you have to consider, what about composite products?
Like a chocolate bar that has cocoa butter and maybe even some palm oil in it?
Yeah, exactly. For those multi-ingredient products, the due diligence focuses on the main listed commodity. So for that chocolate bar, it would be the cocoa they scrutinize, not the palm oil.
Okay, that simplifies things a bit.
Yeah.
But who exactly does this regulation apply to? Is it just companies within the EU?
Not at all. They distinguish between operators and traders, and it applies to both regardless of where they're located.
Can you give us some real-world examples of who these operators and traders might be?
Of course. So an operator could be the company actually harvesting the timber or processing it into furniture. A trader might be the retailer selling that furniture to consumers in the EU. The key point is that anyone involved in putting these products on the EU market, even through imports, is subject to the regulation.
So we're talking about a whole range of players across the entire supply chain.
Exactly. And this leads us to the responsibilities outlined in the regulation. The big emphasis here is on shared responsibility for compliance across all actors in the supply chain.
So it's not just the initial producers who are on the hook, but everyone down the line?
Precisely. Each actor can potentially be held liable for breaches, even if the initial issue happened earlier in the chain. This means everyone needs to be doing their due diligence, and that's a whole other can of worms we need to unpack.
All right, well, let's dive into that due diligence can of worms next time. Then we'll talk about how all this information is actually reported and tracked. And of course, we'll tackle some of those common myths and misconceptions surrounding this regulation. So stay tuned for part 2 of our deep dive into the EU's deforestation-free product regulations. Okay, so let's crack open that due diligence can of worms. What does that actually mean in the context of this regulation?
So it really boils down to 3 key steps. First, companies need to gather a ton of information about the product. We're talking geolocation, data, production details, you name it.
So no more shady supply chains. They need to know exactly where and how those commodities were produced.
Absolutely. Then comes the risk assessment phase. This is where companies have to determine how likely it is that a product might not be compliant with the regulations.
I imagine that can get super complicated depending on the product and the supply chain.
It definitely can. You have to factor in things like the country of origin, the type of forest involved, even the specific production methods used. It's a pretty thorough assessment.
And then the final step is risk mitigation.
Right. If a company identifies a risk, they have to take steps to minimize or eliminate it. This might involve finding new suppliers, changing sourcing practices, or even temporarily halting production altogether. They can't just ignore the problem.
It's not just about ticking boxes. They actually have to address potential issues head on. Now, I've heard that this regulation specifically bans mass balance systems. Why is that? What's the issue with those?
Well, mass balance systems allow companies to mix compliant and non-compliant products, which kind of defeats the purpose of ensuring deforestation-free sourcing. The EU wants a clear and traceable link back to the origin of each commodity. No mixing allowed.
Okay, so they're serious about this traceability thing.
Yeah.
But how does all this information actually get tracked and reported? I imagine there's a mountain of paperwork involved.
That's where the EU's deforestation registry comes in. Companies have to submit electronic due diligence statements through this system. It's all digital.
So it's like a central hub for all this data.
Exactly. And it's not just about companies self-reporting. It allows the Commission and member states to actually monitor compliance and enforce the regulations.
Sounds like a pretty robust system to keep everything transparent and hold everyone accountable.
It is. And there's actually a bonus for companies that are already reporting under other EU regulations. They might be able to streamline their reporting process if they're already providing similar info for other purposes. It can lighten the administrative burden a bit.
That makes sense. Now, anytime you have a big regulation like this, there are bound to be some myths and misconceptions floating around out there. I'm sure you've heard a lot of them.
Oh, yeah, all the time. So let's tackle a few of the most common ones head on.
Sounds good to me. What are people getting wrong about these new regulations?
One of the biggest myths is that this regulation requires companies to track literally every single coffee bean or grain of rice back to its origin.
Yeah, that does sound like a logistical nightmare.
It would be completely impossible, but thankfully it's just not true. The regulation allows for what they call aggregated traceability.
So what does that mean in practice?
Basically, it means companies can group commodities from different plots of land together and report on those areas as a whole. They don't have to track each individual bean or grain.
Okay, so that's definitely more manageable. But what if they only sell a portion of those grouped commodities?
They can use a method called declaring in excess. Basically, they report on the entire sourcing area, even if only part of it ends up in the final product.
So there's some built-in flexibility to account for the real-world complexities of supply chains. Now, what about things like agroforestry? There's this idea out there that this regulation discourages sustainable farming practices like that. Is there any truth to that?
That's another misconception we hear a lot. In reality, the regulation is fully compatible with and even encourages environmentally sound practices.
But didn't we say earlier that converting forest to agriculture is a no-go?
We did, but the key here is that specific definition of forest. Remember, we're using that FAO definition. Agroforestry systems where trees are integrated with crops or livestock aren't considered forest under that definition.
So technically, they would fall under agricultural use, which is permitted.
Exactly. And even within more conventional farming, things like planting groups of trees for windbreaks or erosion control are perfectly fine. The regulation is really targeting that large-scale conversion of forests to monoculture agriculture, not sustainable practices.
That's reassuring, especially for those farmers who are already doing things the right way.
Yeah.
Another concern I've heard is that this regulation is going to disproportionately hurt small and medium-sized enterprises, or SMEs. What do you make of that argument?
Well, it's not quite so black and white. The regulation actually has a number of provisions specifically designed to support SMEs.
What kind of provisions are we talking about?
For one, SME operators are actually exempt from those annual reporting requirements. They also face lighter requirements when it comes to risk mitigation. It's not a free pass, but it does recognize that smaller companies might have fewer resources to dedicate to compliance.
So it levels the playing field a bit. What about those SMEs further down the supply chain, like retailers? What are their obligations?
If an SME is just selling a product that's already been checked earlier in the supply chain, they don't have to do their own due diligence. It helps prevent unnecessary duplication of effort.
Makes sense.
Yes.
It reduces the burden on smaller businesses. So it sounds like they've really tried to build in some flexibility for SMEs.
Yeah, they have. And on top of those exemptions, micro and small businesses also get an extra 6 months to prepare for implementation. So they have a bit more breathing room to get their systems in order.
It's also worth noting that SMEs in the wood sector have already been dealing with due diligence requirements under the EU timber regulation for over a decade. So they kind of have a head start when it comes to these types of rules.
That's a good point. It shows that these kinds of regulations are workable, and SMEs can adapt and thrive even with stricter sustainability requirements.
Okay, last myth on our list. The fear that this regulation is going to throw global supply chains into chaos. Is that a valid concern?
It's understandable that people are worried about that, but honestly, the vast majority of current agricultural production is likely to be compliant already. It's not as disruptive as some might think.
How can you be so sure about that?
Well, remember that cutoff date of December 31st, 2020. Any agricultural production that happened before then is considered deforestation-free under this regulation. So unless producers have been clearing forests for agriculture in the past few years, they should be in the clear.
So it really only affects those who have engaged in recent deforestation.
Exactly. And on top of that, the EU is actively working with stakeholders to ensure a smooth implementation process. They're developing IT systems, creating guidance documents, even providing financial support to smallholder farmers in developing countries to help them meet the requirements. They're really trying to make this work.
It sounds like they're not just setting the rules and walking away. They're invested in helping everyone make this transition to more sustainable practices.
Absolutely. They recognize that this is a global challenge that requires collaboration and support.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground here. Let's do a quick recap for our listeners before we move on to the final part of our discussion.
Sure. So today we've been diving deep into the EU's new Deforestation-free Product Regulation, which aims to ensure that products consumed in the EU aren't contributing to deforestation or forest degradation anywhere in the world.
We've seen how this regulation goes beyond simply banning certain products. It sets up a comprehensive due diligence system that holds everyone in the supply chain accountable for ensuring that those products are deforestation-free.
We debunked some common myths, clarified that the regulation allows for aggregated traceability, supports sustainable farming practices, and even includes provisions to help out SMEs. It's designed to be workable and effective.
And we learned that the EU is committed to working with partners globally to make this transition to more sustainable practices as smooth as possible.
It's a big step forward, but the potential benefits for forests and for the planet are enormous.
So let's jump into the final part of our deep dive, shall we?
Let's do it.
This regulation really seems like it could reshape global trade in a pretty big way.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable. The EU is using its market power to set a new standard for sustainability. It's a bold move.
It's like they're sending a clear signal to producers all over the world. Deforestation-free practices are no longer optional. They're becoming the price of admission to one of the biggest consumer markets on the planet.
Precisely. And I think we could see a ripple effect with more companies adopting similar policies, even if it's just to maintain access to that lucrative EU market.
Now, I'm curious to see how consumers respond to all of this. Will they be willing to pay a premium for products that are guaranteed deforestation-free?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Ultimately, the success of this regulation hinges on both corporate responsibility and consumer demand.
It's a shared responsibility for sure.
Oh.
Well, as we wrap up our deep dive today, what's your final takeaway for our listeners? What should they be thinking about as they go about their day, sipping their coffee or unwrapping that chocolate bar?
For me, the biggest takeaway is this. Our everyday choices really do have a huge impact. Even something as simple as buying a chocolate bar. By actively choosing deforestation-free products, we can contribute to a more sustainable and equitable future. It's about making conscious decisions that align with our values.
Well said. It's empowering to remember that we all have a role to play in protecting our planet. And as we look ahead, what other questions should we be asking ourselves? What else might be needed to truly achieve a deforestation-free future?
That's a great question, and I think it's a crucial one to consider. Are voluntary measures enough, or do we need stronger regulations and stricter enforcement to really move the needle? It's an ongoing conversation and one that we all need to be a part of.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the EU's deforestation-free product regulations. It's been a fascinating conversation.
It really has. Thanks for having me.
And to all our listeners out there, stay curious, stay informed, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive exploration.